Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into some more fascinating ideas?
Always. What are we exploring today?
Well, we're taking a look at Malcolm Gladwell's new book, Revenge of the Tipping Point.
Oh, interesting. I remember the tipping point being such a phenomenon when it came out.
Right. 25 years ago, Gladwell kind of blew everyone's minds with that whole idea that small actions could spark massive change.
Yeah, and it seemed like everything was about positive tipping points back then.
Exactly. But in this new book, he flips the script a bit.
Oh, how
Well,
so?
he explores how those same principles can actually lead to some pretty negative unintended consequences.
I see. So instead of positive tipping points, he's looking at
Yeah, he's really diving into how these hidden forces can drive epidemics of all kinds.
epidemics, huh? Like what kinds of epidemics?
Well, everything from like bank robberies to medical variations and even, viral outbreaks.
Wow, okay, so it's not just about diseases.
No, it's much broader than that. And to help us understand how this all works, we're going to be looking at 3 real-world case studies.
Sounds intriguing. Let's hear them.
All right, so first up, we're going back in time to Los Angeles, 1983.
Okay, back to the 80s. What happened in LA?
Well, picture this. A seemingly ordinary bank robbery.
Okay, a bank robbery. Not that unusual for LA, I guess.
True. But this one is a little different. The robber was this polite young man. They even nicknamed him the Yankee Bandit.
The Yankee Bandit. That's an interesting name for a bank robber. What made him so polite?
Get this. He would actually say please and thank you while he was robbing the bank.
Please and thank you while robbing a bank. That's kind of funny.
Right. You'd almost think it was a joke.
Yeah, like something out of a movie.
Exactly. But here's the thing. This seemingly minor event, this polite bank robber, actually ended up sparking a huge surge in bank robberies across LA.
Wait, so one polite bank robber caused a crime wave? How's that possible?
That's where it gets really interesting. Gladwell argues that this wasn't just some random crime wave.
Oh, so there's more to it.
He actually says it was more like a contagious phenomenon driven by certain individuals.
Like an epidemic almost.
Exactly. And that's where those super spreaders come in.
Ah, the super spreaders. I remember Gladwell talking about those. So who are the super spreaders in this case?
Well, he uses the example of these 2 young guys, Casper and Sea Dog.
Casper and Sea Dog. Those are some unique names.
Yeah, they sound more like, I don't know, cartoon characters than masterminds.
But masterminds they were, I take it.
Oh, absolutely. These 2 guys were responsible for over 175 bank robberies.
Wow, 175. That's a lot of banks.
And it wasn't even just about the robberies themselves. Gladwell argues that they were inspiring a whole generation of copycats.
So they were like the trendsetters of bank robbery.
Exactly. It's a prime example of how a small group of individuals can have an outsized impact.
So we've got bank robbers kicking off a crime wave. But how does this whole contagion thing apply to something like medical treatments? I mean, that doesn't really sound like something that would spread like a virus.
Right. But that's what makes this next case study so intriguing. Gladwell introduces us to this doctor, Dr. Jack Wenberg.
Okay, Dr. Wenberg, what did he do?
Well, he uncovered this really shocking thing. There's a huge amount of variation in how doctors treat their patients across different regions.
Oh, really? I wouldn't have expected that.
Yeah, it's pretty surprising. And get this, where a doctor lives is often a stronger predictor of their treatment style than their actual training or personality.
Wait, so you're telling me that a doctor in, say, New York might treat a patient differently than a doctor in California, even if they have the same training?
It's almost like medical practices have their own regional accents.
That's wild. Do you have an example of this?
Yeah, Gladwell uses this example of cardiac catheterization rates.
Cardiac catheterization. That's a pretty serious procedure.
Exactly. And the rates were drastically different in Boulder, Colorado compared to Buffalo, New York.
So same procedure, different approaches, just based on location.
It really makes you think, right? Like, how much of what we consider individual choice is actually shaped by these hidden forces?
Yeah, it's kind of unsettling.
All right, now let's fast forward to a much more recent event. The Biogen Conference in Boston at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh, yeah, the Biogen conference. I remember that being a big deal early on in the pandemic.
It was a stark reminder of how quickly a virus can spread, especially when a super spreader is involved.
Right. Wasn't there a single person at that conference who ended up infecting a huge number of people?
Yes. One executive ended up infecting something like 300,000 people.
300,000. That's just from one person.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
And what's even crazier is that other people brought COVID to Boston around the same time.
But their cases didn't spread as widely.
Nowhere near as wide. It's like this one person, this one event was a catalyst.
Okay, so this is another example of the power of super spreaders.
Exactly. But it's not just about being in the same room anymore. Gladwell also talks about the science of aerosols.
Aerosols. You mean those tiny particles we breathe out?
Exactly. They can linger in the air for a long time, which means you don't have to be right next to someone to get infected.
That's a sobering thought.
It really makes you think about all the different factors that contribute to an epidemic, right? It's not as simple as just, avoiding sick people.
No, it's much more complicated than that.
So we've got individual behavior, environmental conditions, social dynamics, all playing a role.
It's a complex web.
And to make things even more complex, Gladwell introduces this idea of overstories.
Overstories. I'm not familiar with that term.
So overstories are basically the dominant narratives, the big ideas and beliefs that shape how we see the world.
Okay. Kind of like cultural assumptions.
Exactly. And Gladwell argues that they can be incredibly powerful, shaping how epidemics unfold.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's an example of an overstory that had an impact on an epidemic? Gladwell actually uses a pretty unexpected example, the Florida panther.
Panthers? What do panthers have to do with epidemics?
Well, back in the 1990s, the Florida panther was on the verge of extinction.
Oh, wow. Really? I didn't realize they were in such bad shape.
Yeah, and scientists were kind of stumped as to why.
What was causing the problem?
Turns out the panther population had become super inbred.
Inbred. So, they were all closely related.
Exactly.
Right.
Genetically speaking, they were almost identical.
Oh, I see. So their lack of diversity was making them vulnerable?
It's like a monoculture in agriculture. If one plant gets hit with a disease, the whole field is at risk.
Right, because they're all genetically the same?
Precisely. And it's the same with species. A lack of diversity can create a dangerous vulnerability.
So how do they address this with the panthers? Did they find some kind of cure?
No, it wasn't about finding a cure. What they did was introduce 8 female cougars from Texas into the Florida panther population.
Cougars. Why cougars?
Well, cougars and panthers are pretty closely related, but the Texas cougars had much greater genetic diversity.
So they were basically trying to mix things up, diversify the gene pool.
Exactly. And it worked. The health of the Florida panther population improved drastically.
That's amazing. So they started breeding again, and their numbers rebounded.
Yep. It's a great example of how even a small intervention can have a big impact.
And it highlights the importance of diversity, right?
Yeah.
Not just for panthers, but for, everything.
Absolutely. A lack of diversity makes us vulnerable, whether we're talking about physical health or our thinking or our culture, even our ability to respond to challenges.
Right. It's like putting all your eggs in one basket.
Gladwell also uses another really powerful example to illustrate the impact of overstories. The Holocaust.
Oh, wow. That's a heavy topic.
Yeah, and for years, there was this reluctance to talk about it openly, even within the Jewish community.
It's like there was this cultural taboo, a silence that surrounded it.
And that silence had a profound impact on how the Holocaust was understood and remembered.
So what changed?
Well, in 1978, the miniseries Holocaust aired on TV.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. It was a huge event, wasn't it?
For many people, it was the first time they really grappled with the horrors of what had happened.
It brought the Holocaust into the open.
Exactly. It changed the overstory, making it something people could finally talk about.
It's amazing how a single cultural event can shift the narrative so dramatically.
And it wasn't just the Holocaust. Gladwell also talks about the evolution of how gay characters were portrayed on TV.
Oh, right. For years, gay characters were often just stereotypes, kind of played for laughs.
Exactly. Their sexuality was treated as something to be hidden or a source of comedy.
Yeah, I remember those old sitcoms where the gay characters' relationships were never really explored.
But then came shows like Will and Grace.
That felt like a turning point.
It was. Suddenly, seeing a gay man as a lead character, someone you could empathize with, wasn't so shocking.
And that change in representation had a ripple effect on society.
It paved the way for greater acceptance.
It's all about the stories we tell ourselves, isn't it? They shape how we see the world.
Now, let's look at an example where an overstory, though intended for good, might have unintentionally contributed to a modern crisis. The opioid epidemic.
Okay, how does that tie in?
Well, Gladwell takes us back to the 1930s, and this lawyer named Paul E. Madden, he was on a crusade against narcotics in California.
Interesting. What did he do?
He believed doctors were too freely prescribing narcotics.
So he wanted more oversight.
Exactly. His solution: a triplicate prescription system.
Triplicate, so 3 copies of every prescription.
Yep.
Right.
One for the patient, one for the pharmacist, and one for the state.
Wow, it's a lot of paperwork. But I could see how it would make doctors think twice.
It did. They became much more hesitant to prescribe narcotics.
Okay, so problem solved, right?
Well, not so fast.
What happened?
Fast forward to the 1990s when Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin.
OxyContin, that's the powerful painkiller that played a big role in the opioid crisis, right?
Exactly. And they specifically targeted states that didn't have triplicate prescription systems.
So they found a loophole in the system.
They did, and they exploited it in their marketing, downplaying the risks of addiction.
Wow, that's a sobering thought.
It shows how even well-intentioned overstories can have unintended consequences.
So we got overstories shaping things, and then you have these super spreaders who can ignite an epidemic within that landscape.
Precisely. And to add another layer, Gladwell introduces this concept of group proportions.
Group proportions, what's that about?
He argues that the makeup of a group, like the ratio of different types of people in it, can really influence how that group behaves.
Okay, so it's not just about individuals, but about the dynamics of the whole group.
Exactly. And this is where that magic third comes in.
Ah, the magic third. I remember Gladwell talking about that. So when a minority group reaches a certain size, their influence increases.
You got it. And Gladwell uses some interesting examples, like this integrated housing project in Palo Alto called the Lawrence Tract.
What's special about the Lawrence Tract?
The goal was to maintain racial balance by controlling the proportions of residents.
So they were trying to prevent one group from becoming dominant.
Right. It was a form of social engineering to create a more diverse community.
Interesting approach. But then there was also that example with Harvard's recruitment of women for their rugby team,
Yeah.
right? It seemed like they might have been trying to manipulate group proportions within the student body.
Yeah. That one raised some eyebrows.
It makes you wonder, how far should we go in trying to engineer these proportions?
It's a tricky question for sure.
Gladwell sure gives us a lot to think about. So we've got overstories, super spreaders, and now group proportions all mixed together.
It's like a recipe for complexity.
But understanding these forces can be empowering, right? We can use this knowledge to create positive change.
Absolutely. And Gladwell gives examples of how this has been done successfully.
Like what? What are some examples of people harnessing these forces for good?
Well, one that really stuck with me was this group of activists in the 1980s trying to fight the AIDS epidemic.
Oh, yeah, the AIDS epidemic was such a scary and confusing time.
Exactly. And back then, there was so much stigma and misinformation surrounding it.
Definitely. People were afraid, they didn't understand how the virus spread.
Right, and that fear and ignorance fueled the epidemic.
How did these activists try to combat that?
Well, they realized they couldn't change everyone's mind overnight.
So they focused on a specific group.
They decided to target gay men who were having a lot of sexual partners.
Okay, so they were focusing on the people most likely to spread the virus.
And they weren't trying to shame them or tell them to stop having sex.
That probably wouldn't have been very effective.
Right. Instead, they focused on harm reduction.
So encouraging safer sex practices.
Exactly. They distributed condoms, provided education about safer sex, and really emphasized the importance of knowing your HIV status.
Said they were trying to create a tipping point within that specific community.
Exactly. And it worked. They saw a significant decrease in HIV transmission rates.
It's a powerful example of how understanding these forces can lead to real change.
And it highlights the importance of meeting people where they're at. Not trying to force change, but rather empowering people to make informed decisions.
I think that's a key takeaway from Revenge the Tipping Point. It's not about finding some one-size-fits-all solution.
It's about understanding the nuances, the complexities of each situation.
And then tailoring our approach accordingly.
Gladwell is really challenging us to think differently, isn't he?
Definitely. He's making us question our assumptions about how change happens.
And I think one of the most important things he's highlighting is the power of those small groups, those individuals who can spark a movement.
The super spreaders of ideas and actions.
It's like that old saying, right? Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world.
And it's true. Think about all the social movements that started with just a handful of people.
Exactly. And as we've seen, technology is giving us even more tools to connect with those individuals and amplify their impact.
Social media, online platforms, it's all creating new possibilities for spreading ideas and mobilizing people.
But of course, that also comes with risks, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have to be mindful of how these tools can be used for both good and bad.
It's a double-edged sword for sure.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, I want to leave you with this. Revenge of the Tipping Point isn't just about epidemics.
It's about understanding the hidden forces that shape our world.
It's about recognizing that small actions, can have big consequences, for better or worse.
And it's about empowering ourselves to be agents of positive change.
So, what will your tipping point be? What will you do to make a difference?
That's the question we all have to ask ourselves.
And that's a wrap on our deep dives into Revenge of the Tipping Point.
We hope you enjoyed it.
And we hope it sparked some new ideas and inspired you to think differently about the world around you.
Thanks for joining us.
See you next time.